Hello, I'm Father Greg May, a Redemptorist from the Denver province. As we begin this presentation, it's appropriate we seek the intercession of our Mother of Perpetual Help. So let us together say, Mother of Perpetual Help, with the greatest confidence we come before your holy picture to beseech your intercession. We think of you, our Mother, at the foot of the cross. Your heart must have bled to see your Son in agony. But your joy was great when he rose from the dead, victorious over the powers of evil. Mother of sorrows, pray for us in this time of trial. Help us not to lose heart. Intercede for your people who are afflicted with the coronavirus. Comfort your people who are vulnerable and anxious. Protect healthcare workers who put their lives at risk. Inspire our leaders to make good decisions. Change our hearts so that we may act responsibly. Teach us to trust in God's love and mercy, and to share with you the joy of having courageously faced up to all the challenges of life. Amen. We begin our last session on looking at the specific people who are important in our Redemptorist history. But to help us understand the importance of our tradition, we have to look at the way that we remember people who have shared their lives for the sake of the faith. We have 2,000 years of church history, and it's important to realize that we remember people because of what they've done in our history and how they've made a difference. So the Redemptorists are no different. As we progress forward in looking at each individual that has been recognized by the church, I think it's first important to realize how we celebrate these individuals' lives. Many people will read stories of the saint or the person that they're looking up to, but we also have the tradition of celebrating certain feast days throughout the year. In normally celebrating Mass, we have the sacramentary. And if you look at the very end of it, you'll actually have a calendar. And so on each date, you'll find a specific person who we remember on that particular day. Some are feast days, where of course we celebrate as a community, and others are memorials where the priest or whoever is doing the liturgy might remember them during that time. The Redemptorists are no different. We have actually our own book that remembers the Redemptorist saints and blesseds, and it talks about in celebrating the liturgy of the Word. It talks about celebrating Mass, and so not only within this remembrance of these important people, we also often focus on specific days that are important to us in the life of Jesus. And for example, one that you might not be accustomed to unless you live at a place where Redemptorists work is the Feast of the Holy Redeemer. This is on the third Sunday of July, and so you might never have heard of it before, but for us, we would find it here in this book where we'd celebrate that feast of Jesus. And so it's important as we look to these individuals that are important in the Redemptorist history, we must see that they lived a way of showing the Redeemer's love in our world. And because they express this, it's not always the same. Each one, because of the historical context in which they lived, you'll find a variance on how they expressed Jesus the Redeemer. So just as Jesus lived in the time 2,000 years ago, he was very much affected by the history of his time. And so we have to understand that to understand what he really did. And so these individuals who are a part of our own history, we need to do the same. And one thing, often people say, well, who's the most important? And you list them first and subsequently all the way down to those who might just be blessed. But for the approach that I will be using during this presentation, We're going to be focusing on a historical context, so we're going to actually go in order of when these individuals actually lived and in their own way showed the memory of Jesus, the Redeemer, and what they did in order to do that. And so we're going to go through each one and actually start with the very first person that is important to our history. The first person I start out with is Blessed Maria Celeste Crostarosa. And the reason why we have to see her as the focal point is she's the one who received the vision from Jesus about this new institute, actually two new institutes, one for the women who would be trying to live up to the image of Jesus in our world, especially through contemplation and prayer. And you'll see that she was born in Naples, and then she died in Foggia. She was declared by Pope Francis on June 18th, 2016, as blessed. If it wouldn't have been for her, our order would never have begun. It was through this vision and through working with St. Alphonsus that we understood that Jesus the Redeemer was someone very important that people needed to experience in our world. And so that understanding and relationship was at the foundation and core of both of these institutes. So she was the one who was the foundress for the Redemptorist nuns in 1731, and she was the one who let St. Alphonsus know that he would be the leader of the men's group. Now, when we look at St. Alphonsus, we have to understand that the church has recognized his role in various ways. He lived a long life, as he was born in Naples in 1696, and then died in Pagani in 1787. He was canonized on May 26, 1839, and declared a doctor of the church by Pope Pius IX on March 23, 1871. He's the patron of confessors and moral theologians. This particular Redemptorist, he has his feast on August 1st. And it's important for us as we remind ourselves of what he did. Even before he met Marie Celeste, he definitely had a call of those who were abandoned to see them and to reach out to them. And so being Jesus the Redeemer, trying to be that presence, was very easy for him, since he understood in his own ministry prior to the call that Marie Celeste guided him, he was doing what the Redeemer would have done. And so he was very much, as you heard in the prior talks, very much with seeing what was possible for the people of his time and being attuned to those who were most in need, those who were being neglected. And it really marked his life and ultimately the whole way the congregation moved from that point onward. The next person is Blessed Gennaro Sarnelli. And as you heard in our last session, he was a friend of St. Alphonsus. So before he was ordained, he was working with St. Alphonsus as a young priest and was helping him with the various tasks of reaching out to the poor and the abandoned, especially with the small groups of the communities that were being formed on the streets of Naples. And these evening chapels were really a way that he got to know St. Alphonsus and other projects that St. Alphonsus was involved in. Even though he never really was working in the outlying areas of Naples, he definitely had in his own understanding of what that meant. And so as he was reaching out to the prostitutes and people who might end up in that profession, that he was helping them avoid the one-way road to a terrible life. He was also very much involved with working with the youth. So even though he was not in the official ministry of the congregation in the outlying areas working with the small towns and villages, he definitely was in the spirit of the Redeemer, working with the people of Naples as he had done before with St. Alphonsus, and even after he definitely aligned himself with the congregation. So we really need to understand that you don't always have to do the same thing And there are various ways that you can represent Jesus the Redeemer in our world. And so he was beatified by Pope John Paul II on May 12th, 1996. Of course, we see that he was born and died in Naples. He only lived for 42 years, but was able to do a lot in that time. And actually, he was a writer and probably inspired St. Alphonsus in his writings later on, but he was actually very much into seeing the written word as important in his work that he was doing in Naples. And so his feast is on June 30th. St. Gerard Majella, he's actually a contemporary of both Sarnelli and of Marie Celeste and of St. Alphonsus. In fact, he had written several letters to Marie Celeste. Now, he was born in Numero Lucano in 1726. He didn't live that long. He was only 29 when he died. And he died at Domini in Italy as well on October 16th. Now, of course, we usually find the day of death is often the day that the person is remembered for their feast. So his feast was actually on October 16th. He was canonized by Pope Pius X on December 11th, 1904. Now, as a brother, he was not long with the congregation, and his own story is one of seeing a call to religious life, but there were various obstacles that he faced. He was from a very poor family, and at a young age he was trying to get into religious orders, but they were basically rejecting him because of poor health. We ultimately accepted him in the congregation, and as a brother he was given several tasks, and he'd often go out begging for alms and things that would provide for the people at the different institutions that we had. And of course, often he was, instead of giving things to the confreres, he would give it to other people in need. But he was truly a man that was always there for others. And what probably is most unique about St. Gerard is that he was seen as a miracle worker. And many of the things that he did, there's many stories about miracles that he worked and things he did for others. In fact, he has a large devotion of people who seek his intercessions, especially for those women who were going through pregnancy. So he's considered the mother saint. It's kind of interesting, just kind of a side note, in Mater Domini they have a basilica there and a great devotion to St. Gerard. And you have many people coming from all over the world to see the shrine and to seek his intercession. It's kind of interesting when you go to Pagani, where St. Alphonsus is buried, and it's a basilica also, there's not the crowds or devotion, and the main reason is that St. Gerard works miracles. St. Alphonsus might have be the doctor of a church and had done all these works in what he wrote, and also being a bishop. But St. Gerard is remembered for truly being there for the poor and helping. There's many stories, but he's an inspiration, and as a brother, he gives inspiration to the Redemptorist brothers as well. So he is a part of our history, and one that is remembered even though he did not live that long, but his actions spoke volumes, and he truly made a difference for the people he served. The next person that we're focusing on is really the person that is being honored this year in having a Jubilee year for him. And this is St. Clement Hofbauer. Now, St. Clement, why he's so important for the church and for the Redemptorists are for two reasons that are unique. For the church, he was working in a part of the world that was basically becoming pagan in some ways. It was a world where faith was being fought between the Catholics and the Reformation, the Protestants, and he was in between all of that. His own story is very important. I'll spend a little more time on him because I think it's important to understand who he really is. And as you see the picture beside me, This is one image that is prominent within our congregation remembering him. Now the image you see here is of a sketch. Like I said, you never know exactly what the person looked like, I guess, and this is a rendition of who they think he is, or how he looked. I should say, not so much who he is. Now he was born in the Czech Republic and in Moravia, and in 1751, and then died in Vienna, which is not too far from this location, in 1820. So of course it's 2020, 200-year anniversary, and so that's the reason why we're celebrating his Jubilee year at this time. One of the things I think is important is we talk about him. We know that he was canonized in 1909 by Pope Pius X as well, and he's co-patron of Vienna and Warsaw. And of course, with his death on March 15th, that's the day we celebrate his feast, is on that day. Now, one thing, just to tell you a little bit about him, he grew up in a large family, and at a young age, he had to basically fend for himself because of the poverty, and also because his dad died when he was a boy. And so he had some contact with the Norbertines, and was a person who really saw their faith as important. Now, his mother told him that after her husband's death, after his dad's death, that Jesus would have to be his father, would have to guide him. And he really had a very strong relationship to Jesus. And so for a while, he was a hermit. It's a little bit different from what we talk about a hermit, because they usually were connected to some type of apostolic ministry besides their own penitential life and seclusion. They also had this side where they worked with people. Now, of course, it only lasted till a point when it was outlawed in the empire, and it was at that point he went with a friend to Rome, where he came in contact with the Redemptorists there. Most likely he already had contact through the writings of St. Alphonsus. St. Alphonsus was still alive at this time and was very famous for his writings and trying to help people grow in their faith. And so it definitely inspired St. Clement. Now, while he was there with his friend, he only had a small time learning about the Redemptorist spirituality, who we are, about our rule, and the way that we're called to make Jesus the Redeemer known. And so when he was basically finishing his novitiate, it was only, after taking vows, it was only a couple weeks, and he was ordained as a priest. He already went through much of his studies, but because there's certain things being outlawed in the empire at that time, he was very limited to what he could do. But he was basically being sent from the Papal States, where they had the freedom to practice their faith and to form religious institutes with no problem. But when he got into the empire, they had outlawed any new congregations. It's the same thing that took place in the Kingdom of Naples. And so instead of being able to stay in Vienna and work there, he went to a neutral location, which was Warsaw. And out of that, he was trying to institute the congregation there and to do the work of Jesus the Redeemer with the people. Now, there's many stories about what he did. And he was limited a lot because at this particular time, religious were being suspect, as especially being papists, as they would be called, that somehow Rome would be controlling them and they were a threat to the nation or to the society. And so one of the things that was very important for the Redemptorists in the Papal States, as well as in the Kingdom of Naples, was that they were able to preach missions. Here in Warsaw, it was outlawed. They could not do that. And so St. Clement, as a person of strong faith, he always saw you have to preach the gospel ever anew. And so he made the parish church, St. Benno's, continual mission. So therefore they would have activities throughout the whole day. And so instead of going out to where the people would come to them, to have that support, to have people to hear their confessions, to preach the Word of God. And so it was the means by which he was able to do the Redeemer's work in that situation. Now, unfortunately, Warsaw Poland didn't exist at that time, and so Warsaw was keeping following under certain powers, and so it was constantly changing. So it made it very difficult for him to do ministry, but whatever it took, he would try to do that. And because he was basically in charge and sent forth from Rome to do this ministry, to take the congregation into Northern Europe, it was something that he held very important in his ministry, in his outreach. Unfortunately, when Napoleon conquered, he was expelled. And so at this point in time, that is when he went back to Vienna. But once again, in this particular time in history in that empire, it was one that really did not allow for any new congregations. And so the whole attempt of trying to form the Redemptorists in that territory was one of suspect. He had some friends, and he really worked with, he had friends of all classes, whether they be poor, young, the aristocrats. He was definitely able to touch many people. And so even though they were coming down on him, he had some people on his behalf encourage, respect, even though he was always under investigation. He was someone who was able to figure out a way of getting around those obstacles to preach the good news, to show Jesus the Redeemer. And I think one of the things that he did, which is very important for this lay movement we have today, is that he actually organized the oblates, which were men and women who would partner with him and the other men and redemptorists who were trying to form the congregation. And so these oblates were recognized as people who were important in the ministry. And so we know from the time of St. Alphonsus and Sarnelli that that was a part of their ministry, and so St. Clement is doing the same thing. He was very much into inviting the laity into the ministry. The other thing that was very important was he was always looking at ways, where do you go to allow this congregation to flourish? And so at this particular time, it was a major struggle, because there's so many things that the Catholic Church was being suspect, especially in the northern part of Europe, and trying to figure out how do you reach out to the people to make a difference. And so that's the reason why he was seen as a patron of both Warsaw and Vienna. So even though he's not mentioned in our sacramentary that we have here in the U.S., there's only, like it says, you have St. Alphonsus and St. John Newman. But like for Clement, he would definitely be in those countries in their sacramentary, because he's very important in their history. And so I think in celebrating this Jubilee year, he is a very important person that was responsible for bringing the Redemptorists outside of present-day Italy. And more important is he's the one who laid the foundation for the spread of the congregation throughout the world. Because of his own desire of the missionary spirit, he saw going to the New World, especially in Canada, as a desire to bring the good news, especially those people who need to hear it, who might never have heard it before. So he's the inspiration for the expanding of the congregation, and in many ways, he's called our second founder. Now the next saint is one that should be familiar with here in the United States. We celebrate his feast on January 5th, and this is St. John Newman. His shrine is in Philadelphia. And the importance of his life for us here is that in Europe, in the Czech Republic, he was from Bohemia, and he was born in 1811, and of course he died as a bishop in 1860. Now, he had the studies and everything in Europe to be ordained, but there were too many students who were waiting for that possibility of ordination, and so he actually came to the U.S. to be ordained. And when he got here, he was ordained, but he found a lack in support, and it was through his contact with the Redemptorists that he decided to join us, and he was an important figure in our history. And then, of course, when he became Bishop of Philadelphia, he didn't live a long life, but he definitely was able to make a major difference in bringing other religious people to the U.S. and to do the ministry there. So this particular time in history, we have to realize that the Redemptorists did not start here until 1832. And it was actually the first foundation was up in Wisconsin near Green Bay. And so it's a time in history where a lot of people from Europe were fleeing because of all the wars, and also because of religious persecution. At least here, even though there was religious persecution against the Catholics, there was enough territory you could go and find places where you could find others who believed your own faith, and you were protected from the discrimination that was very prevalent in some of the larger cities here in the U.S. at the time. And in his outreach, in his participation with the Redemptorists, we first went to work with the Indians. And as they're being forced further west, we realized that there is a great need for the immigrants coming from Europe. And so much of our energy was then directed towards starting churches to meet the basic needs of the immigrants here in this country. And so that's how we began, and he is very much a part of that history. He was actually, in 1849, he was the vice provincial, and was for a very short time before he then was made bishop. But we became a province of the Redemptorists in 1850. And so this is a particular time in history when these men coming from Europe, a few vocations here, they actually would be sending them back to Europe to get their studies and then be sent back here. And many men were sent from our houses in Europe to deal with the great need for the immigrants here in this country. And this leads us to our next person, Blessed Francis Xavier Silos. He was a contemporary of St. John Newman. Now, with Blessed Francis, he had a similar story of being in Europe and then coming to the U.S. And he was born in 1819 and lived till 1867 and died in New Orleans. And his feast is on October 5th. Even though he died on October 4th, we celebrate his feast on October 5th. Now, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000. Right now we have, if you go to our place in New Orleans, at St. Mary's, we have a shrine to Blessed Francis Xavier Silos. And he was once again like the other early Redemptorists who came from Europe, came in contact with the congregation here and were ordained. They were men who definitely were trying to stem the tide of people losing their faith here in this country. As they came as immigrants, they very much were supported by these Redemptorists. And so Blessed Francis Xavier Silos is part of our province, the Denver province. And so we have our shrine in New Orleans. If you ever go to New Orleans, you need to go see our shrine for Blessed Silos. Now, this next person, once again, we have an individual who was ordained as a priest and working in Suriname. And he was born in 1809 and then died in 1887. So he's actually would have been contemporaries of Silos and Newman. Now, the thing is, his life, especially working with the poor and trying to make a difference, especially for the ones who were plagued with various diseases, especially leprosy, he was someone who definitely was reaching out to those as the Redeemer would have, trying to restore them and to respect their dignity. Now, he was beatified by John Paul II as well in 1982, and his feast is on January 14th. The important thing about Blessed Peter Donders is that he felt he needed support. And it only makes sense that in being connected to the Redemptorists, that he felt the connection of Jesus the Redeemer doing the work for the people. And so it would have definitely been a part of his spirituality, and by being part of the congregation, it only helped him be able to do that even to a greater extent. And so we celebrate his way of life, especially with the outcasts and those that society did not want to deal with. He was willing to deal with them and truly live with them and die with them. Now, this particular one I'm going to talk about, he was Blessed Gaspar Stangassinger. He was born in 1871 and died in 1899. He didn't live long. Now, he was also beatified by Pope John Paul II on April 24th, 1988. And his feast is on his day of death, which is September 26th. He didn't live that long, but he was very much reaching out to the youth. And I think one of the people who have always been lost in whatever generation are young people. Too often they have many things that take them away from trying to have a relationship to God. And he was definitely focused on the young people. And so he was an inspiration for the short time that he lived with us as a Redemptorist, but he truly was able to impart that desire to work with the outcasts or the abandoned or those who people don't want to deal with, which are often the youth. Now we have to get to another era that took place in Europe. And this is the whole notion of turning society upside down with communism and taking the church and saying it has no validity or value for society. And so we know that as Russia embraced Marxism and you had the whole transformation under Stalin, that the church was being persecuted, and even the other groups that Russia took over, they were also persecuted. And then you had also in Spain a beginning of this idea and antagonism between the church and the elite who wanted to get rid of the church's authority. And so the first ones that we're going to talk about in this particular time in history are the Redemptorist martyrs of Cuenca, Spain. And this is between 1936 and 1938. Their particular feast is celebrated on November 6th. Now, they were beatified on October 13th, 2013 by Pope Francis, but they were also in a collection of many other people from Spain who were also martyred for the faith during that time. And so I could go actually into each detail of each person. You can go probably be better going online and trying to understand what persecution was going on and how many people were killed at this time because of their faith and what they believed in. And it was kind of an anti-religion atmosphere within Europe in many ways. And so in Spain, this was definitely a part of this particular history. Now when we come to Blessed Methodius Dominic Trica, he was from the Czech Republic, and he was beatified by Pope John Paul II on November 4th, 2001, and his feast day is August 25th. He was definitely, in the eyes of the Russian perspective, a threat to society, and so therefore he was basically persecuted because of his faith. And he would go and try to proclaim the good news and make a difference. And so he was definitely someone that, as many other people, were killed or tortured because of what they practiced. And so communism, especially at that time, saw the religion as the foundation of the evils of society. And so it had to be destroyed. And so these particular ones, it's very much a society wanting to get rid of the church, getting rid of Jesus, and in spite of that, people knowing that Jesus the Redeemer needs to be shown, especially through their lives. And the last that we're going to talk about that are also called blessed is the Blessed Nicholas Charnetsky and companions. The Redemptorist martyrs of the Ukraine. So once again, Russia was out to destroy the church, and the Redemptorists who were there were in their crosshairs. And so often, a lot of the times, we had to try to protect our guys from being publicly known, because if they became known, they would actually be sent to Siberia or executed. And it was a hard time, especially in trying to live the faith, knowing that you were doing it with the possibility of being killed for practicing it. But yet, these men, through their lives, they were able to be witnesses of our faith and of truly the importance of Jesus the Redeemer touching the lives of many. As we basically have gone very quickly over the saints and blesseds of the congregation, it's always important to realize that these individuals were responding to bringing the good news in their time in history. And so I think for us, as we look upon our own lives and see the importance of how we can embrace Jesus and the spirituality that belongs to it, there's different forms. And of course, the Redemptorists, as we focus on Jesus the Redeemer, it's about making the Redeemer present to others. And there's obstacles and easy ways of ministering to others at whatever time. And it's seeing that these individuals, in their own way, responded to the best of their abilities to make this spirituality alive in our world. And so we continue that in our own lives. So I thank you for all for participating with all these sessions. And hopefully you have a better understanding of what spirituality is about, and especially the spirituality of Jesus the Redeemer. You also now have understanding of who the Redemptorists are, how we were founded, how Mary, our Mother Perpetual Help, is a key figure in our identity, and also of listening to some of the stories about some of the men who are considered to be holy men, or saints and blesseds in the congregation for the church. And so this is kind of a quick overview of who we are and what we're about in the world. If you have more interest in learning more about us, you can always contact the number on the screen after this presentation. And I'm also listing where you can get this book digitally. So there, if you're interested in understanding some aspects of our prayer, various aspects of our saints, you'll be able to look in here and be able to get that information. So once again, please stay safe and know that you are in our prayers.